What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. Today I've got an exciting one for you. We are building Helga with the companion Keruga. But before we get into that, if you guys want to help me out, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up and you'll be supporting the channel. Shout out to my high contributing patrons, Newsome and Irrelevant. You guys rock. Now let's get into what Helga does. She's going to gain us a life, draw us a card, and she's going to make herself bigger with a 1/1 counter whenever we cast a creature above 4 CMC. And then additionally, she can tap for mana equal to her power, but we can only use that to cast creature spells above 4 CMC. So now you can kind of see why I think pairing her with Keruga is perfect. Keruga is a companion that draws us a card whenever it enters the battlefield equal to the amount of 3 CMC permanents we have on the battlefield. And then additionally, she's going to give us the restriction that we can only use 3 CMC spells in this deck. Knowing that, we have to build the deck in a specific way because we're going to almost always start off behind our opponents. This is going to allow us to use some cards like Cartographer's Map that's going to allow us to get value off of being behind in the early game. And then additionally, we are going to run a lot of cost reducers. As a Root Channeler is one of the best in this deck because it just has a static ability that says, hey, creatures cost X less equal to the amount of life you gain this turn. And then it can tap to add 2 mana, right? But what's important about this is every time we cast a spell, we're gaining a life with Helga, right? So this actually stacks with the amount of creatures we can cast each turn. And it goes without saying, we are going to play some untapping effects in this deck. That way we can untap Helga to get more mana. That's just going to be very efficient to do whenever you have a tap ability in the command zone. Notably, we are not going to run Intruder Alarm because that's a bad card for bad people, but we can use Chakram Retriever. This is where synergy differs from, I don't know, generic goodness, because Chakram Retriever has at least 5 mana, so it synergizes with the commander wanting to cast 4 CMC creatures, and then Chakram Retrievers is going to untap our commander every time we cast a spell. Kind of insane, and with the right setup and enough card draw triggers on the battlefield, this can result in you casting your entire deck. But again, you do need a lot of setup. We are playing a lot of things that care about us casting creature spells, and a lot of cards that draw us a card whenever we cast a creature spell. But in order to be able to cast our entire deck, we're going to need more than just Helga on the battlefield, so that's what's going to make this a little more fair than just including Intruder Alarm in the deck and then casting everything. Additionally, we are going to take a 1/1 counter sub-theme to this deck as well. That way we can make Helga bigger along with the rest of our board state. Then we're going to get a giant board, wipe out our opponents, and yes, we will be playing some haste enablers because you can cast a ton of creatures in this deck and make an entire board state out of nowhere. If that sounds like a deck tech you guys want to get into, let's get into it. Also, I know you guys have been loving this option lately, so if we get this deck to 700 likes, I will go ahead and build an extreme budget version of this deck. The first thing we need to do in this deck is catch up, since we're always going to be essentially 3 turns behind our opponent. Root Channeler is one of the best cards in the deck. This scales amazingly into the late game. Since we're gaining a life every time we cast a creature spell above 4 CMC, we can essentially make it to where we're only having to spend the colored pips to cast all of our creature spells. Yes, you heard me right. We're going to have a 2-mana Voltborn Tyrant entering the battlefield. Goreclaw is super effective here as well because we can slam this right after our commander the very next turn, and that's just going to reduce all of our creatures with above 4 power by 2, which is the majority of the deck. Durnan is pretty solid here as well. Whenever we attack with him, we can exile one of the top 4 cards of our library as long as it's a creature, and then Durnan's going to give that card Dauntless, which means it's going to cost 3 less because we have 3 opponents. Defiler of Vigor is going to be amazing in this deck as well. He basically turns all of the green color pips in our creature's cost into Phyrexian mana, and then whenever we pay life to cast one of those creature spells, we're going to put a 1/1 counter on our entire board. Notably, it only works for 1 green pip per creature, so sorry Voltborn Tyrant, we're still going to have to pay at least 1 green pip. I love pairing this guy with Danny Pink because that's just going to net you a ton of card advantage. Grand Arbiter is not only going to help us out and reduce the cost of our blue and white spells, but it's also going to make our opponent's spells cost more, so we're slowing them down while we get sped up. Archaeomancer's Map is amazing to play from behind. Since they're going to be ramping in the early game, 9 times out of 10 they're probably going to have more lands than us. So dropping this turn 3 can really catch us up back to our opponents. Battle Angels of Tyr, this card is built around being better when you're behind. So slamming this after our commander, drawing a card, gaining a life, getting all the value, and then just getting more value out of Battle Angels of Tyr because we're behind is going to be a solid strategy. Thought Adele, we don't get a run Soul Ring in this deck, so why don't we run Thada Adele instead and steal everybody else's Soul Ring? Another ring it could take is the One Ring, so this thing's just going to steal everybody's rings and catapult us ahead of our opponents. Gwenna Eyes of Gia not only is super solid in this deck because it untaps whenever we cast a creature spell with at least power 5, but it also taps for 2 mana. So if we play this turn 3, it's going to give us upwards to 5 mana, and we're going to feel like we're back in the game. Azusa's Lost But Seeking, kind of the same thing here. We're going to be way behind since everybody else is ramping, but if we drop Azusa's turn 3 and then play 3 lands, we are going to be not only caught up, but maybe even ahead of our opponents. Fairburrow Elder works the same way here. We cast this turn 3, turn 4 we play our commander, and boom, we can instantly tap Fairburrow Elder for 3 mana. We're going to be caught up at that point. Selvala Heart of the Wilds taps for mana equal to the greatest power on the battlefield. Helga gets massive in this deck, and additionally we're just playing massive creatures in this deck. So Selvala Heart of the Wilds is definitely going to catch us back up to our opponents. Last but not least, we have Smothering Tithe. 100% if we're behind and we land a Smothering Tithe, this card catches you up extremely quickly. Moving on, we kind of want to untap our commander, that way we can tap her for more mana, cast more creature spells, and draw more cards. Patriarch's Seal is amazing, not only is it a mana rock, but additionally, it can untap our commander, that way we can tap her again to add more mana to our mana pool. Sereth the Viper's Fang checks all of the boxes. It's 4 CMC, so it triggers our commander, it untaps our commander, and it's going to give our commander hexproof whenever it's untapped. It does everything we want it to do. Derevi has a ton of utility here. Not only does this untap our commander when it enters the battlefield, but then we can go to combat and untap our commander even more. I did want to note, we do have a way to give our creatures flash in this deck, so if our creatures have flash and we go to combat and we untap our commander like 5 times, we can float all of that mana, and since we don't have to leave the combat step to play all of our creature spells since they have flash, we're able to use all that mana to cast a ton of creature spells, netting us some insane value. I did also want to mention this pairs amazingly with Chulane as well, since Chulane can put it back into our hand and then we can cast it again to either untap Chulane or our commander. This can kind of just be a way to draw additional cards to find more answers, find more creatures to cast, or it can just be another way to untap our commander and start storming off again. Chakram Retriever is not okay in this deck. I even debated not including it, but it kind of checks all of our boxes. Almost too good though. It's above 4 CMC, so it triggers our commander, and then it has this broken ability. Whenever you cast a spell during your turn, untap target creature. Our commander's a creature, you all know that. So all we have to do is cast a creature spell, untap our commander, then we tap our commander for mana to cast another creature spell, untap our commander, and then we're drawing a ton of cards in between there. We have a ton of ways in the deck to draw additional cards whenever we're casting creature spells besides our commander. So we can draw upwards to 3-4 cards sometimes just by casting a creature spell, and then whenever you're doing that and tapping your commander for increasingly more mana, you kind of just get to a point where you're able to cast your entire library, which is kind of insane, honestly. I'm also going to include both of the Sakashimas here. Not only are they both 4 CMC, it's also just super busted to have double copies of our commander. What's going to happen now whenever we cast a 4 CMC creature is not only do both of them get bigger because they have the same ability, but we're going to draw 2 cards and gain 2 life also. So now we have another incredible mana dork that gets bigger and taps for increasingly more mana. We're also doubling up on all of our card advantage in life gain. That's too good not to include. Chulane Teller of Tales, kind of built for this deck. Not only is it another way to cheat lands into play, it draws us cards whenever we cast a creature spell, we can also just return creature spells back to our hand. So maybe we fizzle out, run out of 4 CMC creatures to cast, and we have a lot more mana from Helga. We can go ahead and just return one of those 4 CMC creatures back to our hand, recast it, get more card advantage, and hopefully draw into more cards to cast. Not to mention you can also use Chakram Retriever with this guy, and that's going to feel pretty broken as well. Let's set up a crazy scenario. If we have Chulane Teller of Tales on the battlefield, Chakram Retriever, Selvala Heart of the Wilds, and Suruk and Goreclaw, we can go ahead and cast our entire library. All we have to do here is tap Selvala for 7 mana, which is not very hard in this deck. And then once we tap her for 7 mana, we'll tap Chulane, returning Selvala back to our hand. And then we can recast Selvala for 3 mana. So we spent 6 mana there, but we tapped her for 7. That means we have 1 floating. Whenever we cast Selvala, we're also going to get 2 triggers, one off Chulane and one off Chakram Retriever. So we're going to draw a card off of Chulane and then cheat a land into play if we have it. And then additionally, Chakram Retriever is going to untap our Chulane. Once that happens, happens, Selvala can now enter the battlefield, and since we have Goreclaw on the battlefield giving Selvala haste, we can instantly tap her and repeat the process. Now this takes a little bit of setup, but once we get there, we can cast our entire deck. We're also running Beast Whisperer, Radagast the Brown, the Great Henge, Guruk's Uprising, Outcaster Trailblazer, and Voltborn Tyrant. Anything that's going to draw us a card whenever we cast or a creature card enters the battlefield is just going to help us draw a ton of cards and cast a ton of creatures. Inga and Asika is also amazing here because it says whenever you cast a creature spell, if 3 or more mana from creatures was spent to cast it, draw a card. And our commander is only able to cast creature spells with her mana. So as long as we're spending 3 mana into a creature, we're drawing cards. Additionally, Inga and Asika are just amazing because they allow all of our other creatures to cast creature spells because now they can tap for mana. So just a solid include overall. Galadriel Light of Valor is another way to buff up our board. She can ramp us a little bit and she can draw additional cards. So she's going to be amazing in this deck. I'm really excited about Archangel of Thune in this deck because remember, whenever we cast a creature spell that's above 4 CMC, we're going to gain a life. And Archangel of Thune says whenever you gain life, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. So now our creatures are getting massive whenever we're casting more creatures. That's exactly what I want to do in this deck. Thundering Nightmare, also pretty solid. It basically turns our commander into a Mana Gorger Hydra, so now whenever our opponents are casting spells, our commander is just getting massive. If they don't put a stop to this, we will run away with the game. Season of Gathering is amazing as well. This is very flexible. All modes are very usable here. We can put up to 5 counters on our commander, giving it Vigilance and Trample, which doesn't really matter, but 5 counters on our commander can be massive. We can also destroy all artifacts or enchantments, and additionally, we can draw a ton of cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control. This deck makes some massive creatures. Visions of Dominance, another solid way to put a ton of counters on our commander, even doubling the counters on our commander. Kind of crazy. Slippery Bogbonder, amazing as well. Remember, we are playing cards like Archangel of Thune, we're on Defiler of Vigor, a ton of different ways to put a ton of counters on all of our creatures. And then Slippery Bogbonder has flash and says, whenever Slippery Bogbonder enters the battlefield, put a hexproof counter on target creature. Our commander, obviously, and then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. So now that we've buffed our entire board up, we can move all of those creatures onto our commander. Our commander is going to have hexproof, and then we are able to tap her for an insane amount of mana. Again, causing us to go off and probably winning the game. Let's talk about the creatures above 4 CMC that we're going to want to run because this deck needs a high density to work efficiently. Shalai Voice of Plenty is going to be amazing here. It's going to give all of our other creatures hexproof, and for 6 mana, we can put a 1/1 counter on our entire board, which is just going to synergize with our counter theme that we have going on. Glenalendra Archmage, again, 4 mana, and we can sacrifice Glenalendra Archmage to counter a non-creature spell. This is amazing protection for our commander, and then remember, it has Persist, and this is a deck that cares about 1/1 counters. So for instance, let's say we have Glenalendra Archmage on the battlefield, and then Galadriel. Whenever we sacrifice Glenalendra to counter a non-creature spell, it's going to enter the battlefield, and then we can choose Galadriel's ability to put a 1/1 counter on all of our creatures, and that's just going to straight up get rid of the -1 counter on Glenalendra, allowing us to kind of sacrifice her a ton and counter a lot of spells. This card puts in some absolutely absurd work in this deck. Mystic Snake, also kind of niche here, but also kind of perfect. It's just a 4 CMC creature that's a counter spell. Usually a huge downside, but here, not only does it trigger our commander, but it's also going to protect our commander. So if we're setting up for a massive turn, leave our commander untapped or 4 mana open, and we know we're going to be able to untap with our commander. Asceticism, again, this isn't a creature, but protecting our commander is key. She's super important to the strategy. We're casting massive creatures. We do not want to lose them to a random removal spell. Nyxbloom Ancient, kind of crazy here, because this works for permanence. This means whenever we tap our commander, we're going to add triple the amount of her power to our mana pool instead. Getting this on the battlefield with your commander, as long as she's got decent power, basically means you're probably going to run away with the game. Railway Brawler, again, synergizing perfectly with those 1/1 counters, not to mention we can plot it, so that's super helpful. This is just going to cause an insane turn and make some really massive creatures. AC Tyrant of Gyre, I love this card as well. Again, we can use it to catch up to our opponents. It puts additional lands into play. It draws more cards. We're just going to outvalue them in the late game, and they can have the early game, right? Coma Cosmos Serpent, super oppressive card. If we get this on the battlefield, we're going to hose over their activated abilities, and then we're going to trample over them with a ton of 3/3 snakes that are getting buffed up by all of our 1/1 counters. Suruk and Goreclaw, amazing here. This is our haste enabler for the deck. The deck doesn't care a ton about tokens, so the fact that this works for non-tokens is perfect, and this is going to be 9 times out of 10 how we kill the table when we have a massive storm turn and cast a good portion of our deck. The green Oher is going to be amazing here. We just dig deep and we throw a creature onto the battlefield. Notably, this does care about how much power we're hitting someone with, and we have 1/1 counter synergies in this deck, so we can make Oher massive, and then we can kind of turn it into a tutor that finds whatever creature card we need because it's hitting for so much damage. Blossoming Bogbeast, another solid game ender in the deck. There is a little bit of a life gain sub theme in this deck, so Blossoming Bogbeast is going to be perfect here. If we cast a ton of creature spells, give them haste with Suruk and Goreclaw, and then attack with our Blossoming Bogbeast, that is going to end the table's life right then and there. Nezahal Primal Tide, just Ristic Study on a giant dinosaur. You've got to love that. Danny Pink synergizes amazingly with our cards like Galadriel, Defiler of Vigor, Shalai. Anything that puts a 1/1 counter on all of our creatures is going to be amazing here. Springleaf Avenger is basically an Eternal Witness, but on a creature that deals a ton of damage, so I'm going to give this a try right here. Aerial Extortionist is super simple here. It's just going to keep all of our opponent's key cards off of their battlefield. Foundation Breaker, a 4 CMC creature that destroys an artifact or enchantment. Usually terrible, but it's amazing here because it also has Convoke, so we can cast it early if we need it, and then late game we can go ahead and cast it, netting us a solid commander trigger. Bane of Progress just comes in and hoses all artifacts and enchantments while getting massive. Kami of Whispered Hope, I really like this here because it's going to double up on all of the counters we're giving our commander. Now, I know it just says add an additional 1, but whenever you're only adding 1 at a time, you're essentially doubling it up. And then this thing's just going to make our board massive while being able to tap for a ton of mana. Amphin Mutineer, again, super solid removal that's also 4 CMC that synergizes with our commander. Disciple of Freelease, also going to be amazing here. It enters the battlefield, we sack a creature, we gain a ton of life, we draw a ton of cards, and it's a land. What more could you ask for? Last but not least, we have a couple niche cards. We have Void Slime, 3 mana counterspell that also counters abilities. Kind of not great because it's 3 mana, but perfect in this deck since we're only able to use 3 CMC counterspells. Mutation Advantage, another solid way to give all of our creatures with counters hexproof and indestructible. Again, protecting our commander, super important here. The Skullspore Nexus. Now, this might be a head scratcher because we're actually not trying to sacrifice our creatures here, but the fact that for 2 mana we're able to cast this thing that replaces all of our giant creatures whenever our opponents are trying to destroy them is amazing. And then additionally, for only 2 mana, we're able to double the power of our commander, which is just going to have her tap for double. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and include that here. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. Remember, don't forget to leave a like. It's free. It helps me out a ton. So if you're enjoying the videos and you enjoy the work that I do, a like and subscribe goes a long, long way. With that being said, I would like to shout out my high contributing patrons, Newsome, Irrelevant, Chicken Salad, Excessum, and Praetor. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped all of you guys in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.